In this video, you'll learn about the evolution of skin color. But before we jump into that, let's review some of the basic things we've already learned about evolution. So far, we've learned that genetic variation already exists in every population. And this is because DNA replication is not perfect and mutations can arise. We also learned that certain environmental factors can favor the reproductive success of some individuals over others. And what this means is that certain traits will be passed on more than others if they provide an advantage in a specific environment. And in this way, populations will change over time. And this leads us to our definition of evolution, which is that the frequency of alleles or specific gene versions can change over time in response to environmental pressure. We've also learned a little bit about divergent and convergent evolution. Now, remember, diverge means to start in one place and go off in two directions. This is as opposed to converge, which means that you're actually starting in two different places and then ending up in the same place. So from an evolutionary perspective, divergent evolution means that a common ancestor, a single species, facing various selective pressures from the environment, eventually evolved into multiple different species. Recall, this type of evolution leads to homologous traits. In contrast, convergent evolution means that two different species, perhaps living in similar environments, faced similar selective pressures. This will not lead to homologous traits, but rather it leads to traits that are similar because the environment was similar, but that these traits are not actually evidence that these two species evolved from a common ancestor. So we could summarize by saying that divergent evolution leads to homologous traits, those that arise and are evidence of common ancestry, and convergent evolution leads to convergent traits that arise as a result of being exposed to similar environmental pressures. Now, as it turns out, skin color is actually a great example of convergent evolution in humans. But what does that really mean? To get you thinking about it, I'm going to start off by posing a question. The question I want to pose to you is whether or not you would think that your skin color is a good indicator of your genetic relationship to other groups of modern humans. And what I really mean by this is, do you think that individuals with a similar level of skin pigmentation, either dark or light or medium skin tone, do you think that skin tone can be used to examine how closely related or how similar your DNA is to another individual? Take, for example, an instance where you're sitting in a classroom. And in that classroom, you look around and there's lots of individuals with various levels of skin pigmentation. If you were to look at two individuals with light skin or two individuals with dark skin, do you think it would be safe to make the assumption that the two individuals with darker skin would share more of their DNA and would have would be more closely related in their ancestry? Now, it's a common misconception that the answer to a question like this would be yes. But in truth, the answer is no, absolutely not. Your skin color is not a good indicator of how closely related you are to another human being. And the reason for this is that skin color is actually a highly adaptive and rapidly evolving trait. And now remember, when I say rapidly, I mean rapidly on an evolutionary timescale. So experts believe that skin color can change in as little as 100 generations. Now, 100 generations might sound like a long time, but from an evolutionary perspective, it's the blink of an eye. So what this actually means is that whether you have light skin or dark skin, or your family has light skin or dark skin today, your family may have actually, in as little as 2,500 years ago, had a different skin tone. But why? Why are there so many different skin colors? And why does skin color evolve so much more rapidly than certain other traits in the human population? We know that the different skin colors or skin tones are created by the amount of melanin that your skin produces. And we won't go into the details of this, but essentially melanin is a type of molecule called a pigment that is going to essentially play a protective role in the skin. So the more melanin you have, the more protection you have from the ultraviolet light created by the sun. And it's actually this ultraviolet light that creates the environmental selective pressure on the skin color or the skin tone to evolve so rapidly. As it turns out, ultraviolet light exposure actually affects the levels of two very important vitamins in our bodies. The first is vitamin B9, also known as folate, and the second is vitamin D. So you may know that vitamin B9 is very, very important for the process of DNA synthesis. And vitamin D is important for many processes, but especially important for creating strong bones. In order to synthesize adequate levels of vitamin D, we need sun exposure. So when the rays of the sun shine on our skin is able to start this first step of synthesizing vitamin D. However, at the same time that this sun exposure is helping our body to synthesize vitamin D, the sunlight can also destroy the vitamin B9 or folate that our bodies have stored. So you could imagine there is a perfect amount of sunlight that you want to get. Enough to synthesize plenty of vitamin D, but not so much that you're destroying your levels of folate. Thus, the sun is creating a selective pressure that could favor either more or less pigmentation depending on the amount of sunlight you're exposed to each day. Hopefully now you understand how the sun could create a selective pressure on the amount of melanin produced by the skin. However, to understand the evolution of skin color, we're still missing an important piece of the puzzle. Because if the amount of ultraviolet radiation or the amount of sun that the Earth received globally was equal in every place, we still wouldn't have seen this rapid diversification of skin color. As it turns out, most of you are probably aware that various places on Earth receive far more or far less sunlight than others. For example, if you add the latitudes onto this map, you'll see that the equator at 0 degrees receives much higher levels of annual ultraviolet radiation than does 60 degrees or even 30 degrees. So as you move away from the equator, the amount of sunlight you would be exposed to in that environment would decrease rapidly. In this chapter, we also learned that humans first evolved in Africa. However, they didn't stay there for long. Ever since the first modern humans evolved, they've been on the move. And so this would mean that as these various populations moved around the world, they would be constantly exposed to different environments where the level of ultraviolet radiation would vary. Recall, however, that in order for a trait, the frequency of a trait, to increase or decrease in the population, we need to have differing levels of reproductive success. So we need to ask ourselves, how did these different levels of sunlight that these populations were being exposed to, how did these lead to differences in reproductive success? So if you recall, we said that vitamin B9 or folate is really important for DNA replication. You could imagine that when you're growing a baby, you're going to need plenty of folate because during that time, the baby is going to be constantly, the baby and you are going to be constantly synthesizing new DNA. So if you didn't have enough folate, this might inhibit you from having children. At the same time, remember, vitamin D, you need plenty of sunlight to synthesize vitamin D. You could imagine that if you did not have enough vitamin D, your bones might be too weak to bear children. And in this way, this would also impact the number of offspring you could produce and contribute to the next generation. Let's take a look at how this would work in an environment that receives high levels of annual ultraviolet radiation, for example, near the equator. In this environment, there's plenty of sun available, and thus your skin would have no trouble synthesizing plenty of vitamin D. But you could also imagine, with all of this sunlight available, you'd be in a greater danger of having your folate damaged. Thus, in this environment, individuals with more pigmentation would have an advantage because they'd have more protection for their folate. Conversely, in environments with very low levels of UV light, such as far away from the equator, there's much less sunlight available. So you could imagine that there's a much lower danger of having your folate damaged. However, with such low levels of sunlight available, it might be difficult for your skin to synthesize adequate levels of vitamin D. And thus, in this environment, individuals with lower levels of pigmentation would be at an advantage because more sunlight is enabled to penetrate their skin. So let's return to this idea of skin color being a convergent trait. Remember, a convergent trait is evidence of a similar environment rather than common ancestry. And what this really means is it tells us about where your ancestors lived and really not much about who you're most closely related to. So in the picture on the right here, you could imagine that if one population, population A, originally lived near the equator, right, they'd be receiving high levels of sunlight and darker pigmentation would be favored. However, if that same population moved north, away from the equator, where they were receiving lower levels of sunlight, over in as little as 100 generations, remember, this population B, which evolved from population A, could eventually evolve a lighter skin tone. And then if that individuals from that same population B were to move back towards the equator in as little as another 100 generations, you could see the evolution of a darker skin tone. And so in comparing those populations, you'd find that population B is actually more closely related to both population A and C than A and C are to one another. So let's end with a couple of take-home points. The first being that I want you to remember that evolution can only work on existing genetic diversity. And so it's very interesting to note that a recent study found that many of the genes that are responsible for light pigmentation, not only did they originate in Africa, but they are still present in Africa, right? So our skin color is really not evidence of any genetic differences between individuals. And I'll leave you with a quote from Nita Jablonski, who's one of the leading experts in this field. She says that skin pigmentation levels have changed more than once in human evolution. And because of this, skin coloration is of no value in determining phylogenetic relationships among modern human groups.